There's nothing in the traditional sense that happened in the first 32 years of my life that would say, yes, this is a budding author. This child will become an author. There's nothing, almost nothing. I didn't read as a kid. I didn't read as a young adult. I didn't particularly like books. I avoided books. I wanted to be outside riding my bike and playing with my friends and just doing everything that kids did. I grew up in East Brownsville, and directly behind the house, I mean, open the back door, right there, from the portón right there, across the alley, whatever that was, 10, 12 feet, was Canales. And that's where my sister had gone, and it was assumed that I would go there too. Every kid in the neighborhood went there. I went to Canales all of one day. My mother somehow found out that the teacher that I had been assigned was a teacher's aide. Now, my mother and father never finished school. I think my mom maybe got to the 9th or 10th grade, and maybe my dad to the 7th or 8th grade, something like that. And but she knew there was a difference between a teacher who was certified and a teacher's aide. She knew that that we weren't talking about the same thing. And so she went and spoke to the principal and said, you know, I want my son to have a real teacher. And he said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Casares, but we don't have enough real teachers, and your son has to stay in the class that he was assigned. And I think she got in an argument with him, and she said, fine, I'm pulling him out today. And not knowing what to do and, you know, how I would go to another school, the only thing they could think of was to put me in the Catholic school. So they put me in St. Mary's. It's fine, but it's getting expensive. And after the second year, they thought, let's try to find something else. And since I had been making the trek over there, they thought, well, why don't we keep him in this neighborhood out there and right by St. Mary's? So they started sending me to what was then called Ebony Heights and is now Martin Elementary. And so I did that 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. So by the time it was time for junior high, I said, well, I don't, you know, I really don't want to like keep going all the way across town. Let me go here in the neighborhood. Let me go to Falk. I must have been in a fight like every other week or something. I mean, you know, it was what, you know, what the reputation was. I mean, I was there. I saw it. And you know, I mean, I had a good enough time, and I had friends and everything, but it was very very distracting, you know, and I saw where it was going, because, you know, my parents had to go a couple of times because I'd gotten in fights in the room or outside or whatever. And we said, well, okay, there's only one more year, because it was in junior high, it was only 2 years. So I went back across town, this time to Central. And so I spent a year at Central. And by this time, you know, I'm meeting kids from all over town, because you know, it's not the same kids that were at Ebony Heights, you know. And so I did my 8th grade there, and then in high school, I did the 4 years at Porter. Though I don't know that I could have articulated it back then, I knew that there was a difference between the type of teachers that were here, though I'm sure I know there were certified teachers at Canales, but that there was a difference between the two schools. That the schools were being given different attention, you know, or maybe had different resources. And yet, this is the neighborhood that I lived in. This is the neighborhood that I was a part of, that I spent the majority of my time in and played with all my friends who went to that school. I had a chance to see socially different sides of Brownsville. It was one more version of living on a border. ¿verdad? Because on a border, you're going between languages, you're going between cultures. And it was that same sort of negotiation from going from East Brownsville to this other neighborhood, right? I know that I had spent a lot of time feeling very frustrated, and like there was a lot that I wanted to say, but that I didn't know how to say it. And I knew that I was looking for, I was very much into at that time, very much into pop culture, and I was looking, for outside influences, and just feeling very, very trapped. Porter was, I don't think it is anymore, very, very conservative. I mean, it was as conservative as anything that I knew in Brownsville to be. And so any sort of expression that was a little bit different just was not tolerated. But I grew up with these two tíos, my tío Héctor and my tío Nico. And they were both great storytellers. And they would come over to the house and just start. And they had they had their set stories, and then they had new stories that they'd bring up occasionally. And that was the only thing that brought me inside the house. And I was, I could listen to them for hours, just hours, and how they did it. I was just like, there was nothing that was more fun for me than to listen to my tíos tell stories. And they were stories that had happened when they were kids. And this is an older generation. I mean, I'm very blessed, though I didn't see it at the time. I definitely realize it now. I was born into a much older family. It also meant that I grew up in a family that had these elders who had this treasure of stories that dated back literally into the mid-1800s. Because these are the stories that they had heard from my grandfather, and that they had heard from their grandfather, right? So I was getting these stories, and I was like, oh my God. I mean, it was better than anything I was watching on television, and I know it was better than anything I could have found in a book. Even now, I can't find anything as good as those stories. And that was where it started. It was an oral tradition that took the place of a literary tradition. I started getting older and become a little bit more conscious of books, and I'm reading books every once in a while, but it's not anything I'm doing on a regular basis. And people will occasionally say, well, maybe you should write. And I'm thinking, I can't write. I'm not a writer. A writer is someone who grew up reading books. He's one of these little precocious little kids who taught himself to read when he was 3 or 4. He has the dad who, smoked the pipe, and big leather chair, wingback chair, and they had books all over, and we didn't have any books in my house. None. We had a phone book and a book about Kennedy, his first 100 days in office, or something like that. But we didn't have any books. There were maybe a Bible. That was it. So the idea that I would become an author, it was so beyond me. I did not feel entitled. That is not something that was an option for me. That just was not on the table. But one day, and it was just a complete fluke, I thought, I had been out the night before telling stories with some friends in a bar. And I thought, what if I could write the story I told last night? Not a new story, but just a story that I told, and it was one of my tío stories. What if I could just write that story down, and what if it was as good as what I said the night before? So I tried to basically dictate or transcribe what I had said the night before. And I just wrote it out on a legal pad, and it took, 4 or 5 pages. And I looked at it, and it wasn't half bad. I thought, that's not bad. It was very easy because I knew the beginning, middle, end. It was I didn't have to create anything. I just had to get it down on paper. So I thought, well, let me try another one. I'd try another one. And I keep doing this for several weeks. And I start going to readings. I start asking people, what books should I read? I start reading those books. I start reading books about the authors that I've read. I start reading criticism about those books. And I just keep, step by step, educating myself. And it was this way. It was a very sort of pure way of doing it in the sense that, you know, I was very hungry to know how these writers did it. I knew how storytellers did it, but I wanted to know how the writers did it. And so I read in wanting to know, to just sort of figure out how they did it, figure out their methods. And I would, you know, study the story and the architecture of the story and just the way it moved and how it ended and why things were in certain places. And very slowly I was getting a better sense of it. But having done it this way, as opposed to having gone through a traditional method of going through, you know, getting an English degree and learning the canon and such, would you know, is very useful. In this other way, it allowed me to form my own opinions. You know, read the everything that had been written about the text. You know, all the supplemental material, all the criticism, and all the biographical material as well, but without somebody there to interpret it for me, so that I was interpreting it as a storyteller and as a person becoming a writer. I do this for 4, maybe 5 months, and I get to the point and I say, you know what, I'm going to do it. And I was very comfortable in the career that I had. I had been working in advertising for this agency in Austin called GSD&M. And GSD&M is the agency that, before I got there, had developed Don't Mess with Texas. So it's sort of the Texas agency. And it's the agency that everybody wanted to get into. And I got into it and had tremendous opportunity and was successful and had all these accounts and spent a lot of time traveling to Los Angeles and New York and Chicago and just San Francisco, and just had a very enjoyable, comfortable life. Nothing that I was necessarily burnt out on and that I wanted to change, but I had found something that I knew that I was beginning to love. And my biggest fear was that I would get to a point where I would look back and say, you know, maybe that could have happened, but I didn't. I had this other thing going on. I had too many things going on. And I thought, you know, I don't want to get to that point. I would rather see if I can do it, and if I don't do it, ni modo, it didn't work out, but I tried, you know, and I'll just go back to what I was doing. You know, I already had established myself. It would be, I thought, easy enough to get back in. So 5 months into this experiment, I walk in and I quit my job. And I remember that morning, I had told people I was going to do it, and you know, I hadn't told my boss yet, but I was, you know, my family knew. I remember calling my father, and he said, "What do you know, how are you feeling?" And I said, "Well, I got to tell you, I'm nervous. I'm a little afraid." And he said, "What do you want to be afraid for?" He said, "You know what? If you have just a little bit more faith than you have fear, you're going to be okay." I didn't realize the implications of what I had done. But what I had done essentially was I had just cleared my desk and said, I am not going to think about anything but this. For 6 months, for a year, I'm not going to do anything but this. And you know, in a way, it would have been much easier to keep working and to, you know, I would have had something to hide behind, right, had it not worked out. And so that first day, I was like, oh my God, what did I do? You know, because I've declared to the world that I am going to become a writer. How insane is that? What arrogance and audacity, and I mean, what were you thinking? And I was paralyzed. I was paralyzed for like a day or two. I couldn't do anything. I was just like, what did I do? And you know, because there was nothing that I could say, oh, I've got to go do this. I can't do it right now. There's nothing else. There's nothing you have to do but sit your butt in that chair and write that book you said you were going to write. And if it doesn't happen, it's because you know, you couldn't do it. You didn't have the nerve to stay and do what you said you were going to do, or you didn't have the talent. One of those two. I think I knew that I had to put myself through that. I had to go through that fire, or it wouldn't have happened. I started writing again, and then I didn't look back. I just kept going. And my dad worked every job you can imagine. He was a policeman, he was a fireman, he drove a cab, he was a delivery man for Coca-Cola. He spent 33 years working for the USDA. He rode horseback along the Rio Grande, up and back, I mean, until he was 69 and had to retire, or, you know, was at the point where he was going to retire. You know, the idea of becoming an artist was so beyond. I mean, nobody is an artist in my family. I mean, that's not something you do. You go, you find a good paying job. You go, you spend your time in school, and then you find the job and you start working, and you do it very traditionally. The only way I could give myself permission to do this was to do it and to feel like I was moving forward, like I was on a path. So I would do things, for instance, it occurred to me that because I was writing about a particular region, and I had already become aware of how many authors became identified, and sometimes negatively so, not negatively so, but in a limiting way to a particular region, and you know, the regional writers, you know, as though they don't have a voice beyond that. And I was aware of that, and I wanted to sort of, you know, for me, I felt like these stories of my family, what I knew about the Valley, were so rich that it would be a shame if they didn't get out into the world. I thought, well, if these stories are going to have legs, if they're going to be stories that people in New York or San Francisco or Minnesota, wherever, are going to want to read, they've got to be stories that can be published in those places as stories. So I wouldn't send my stories anywhere in the Southwest. I wouldn't send a story to any publication in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, you know, Nevada. I sent it, the only closest was Northern California. And that's it. And then I would go to the Midwest, and I'd go to the Northeast. And I had a map, and I said, this is my area. And if I can get it published there, then this means something. And it wasn't that I didn't, you know, there's some very good journals and magazines throughout this region. We've got a rich history in that way. But I felt that they would be looking at it differently, either sympathetically, or they would know things about the region. And I wanted it to be read with eyes that never knew anything about this. But it was the only way that I could move forward. First lesson that I learned as a writer was that the single most valuable commodity is time. That there is nothing that is more valuable than time. finding that time and holding that time and appreciating that time on a daily basis is a big challenge. I mean, even when you have the time to stay focused and to not lose that hunger. The motivation has to come internally, and it's, you know, it's a challenge to put yourself out there. Part of what I think motivated me initially too was that I felt that there was a perception of the border region that just simply was not accurate. You know, when people thought of the border, they thought of everything that was wrong with the border. And part of that has to do with, I think, just regionally how kind of remote we are. That if a national news organization is going to come down here to cover an event, it usually is something catastrophic, you know. So it's some heinous crime, something, some drug cartel, some whatever. That they're not going to come, they're not going to drive 200 to 300 miles down here to cover ordinary people, right? And so the consequence is that the rest of the world thinks that it's all drug lords and, you know, drug traffickers and what have you. Where I want to believe that my work ended up was in showing people on the border as simply people. Gente. Loving, hating, messing up, doing all the things that people do. That yes, they're very tied to their culture. Yes, the language is key to that. But that these readers are seeing them as humans. They're seeing them as humans first, and then they're seeing them as Mexicanos. There's a theory that you write the kind of book that you would want to read, that you want, right? And you know, to get back to my earlier point, I think I wrote that book that I wanted as a kid, that I wanted to see some part of my experience, that I wanted to understand what this was about. I would hope that I'm still evolving as a writer. I've felt my best when I'm a little bit afraid, but I have a little bit more faith, right? I mean, when I have a little bit of fear, that usually tells me that I'm on a good path, that, you know, something good's happening here. There's a girl who came up to me and said, "I want to be a writer." She already knew this, you know, and I'm not sure if she had read my stuff or what, but she was very, and then later she graduated, and I heard that she'd won a scholarship and had to get up and give a little bit of a, you know, speech, and had said that, you know, that this was something that she really wanted to do. And they asked her later, and it was, you know, in part this conversation that we had that sort of had confirmed, you know, I think she was already on that path. It's great. I mean, I probably save her a lot more time than, you know, I waited, you know, whatever it was, an extra 15 years before I started writing.
To continue a bit of our exercise yesterday in mining our histories, our you know, really all the material that you have inside you that you.
What I tell students is they have to find a way of finding their voice. They have to become very comfortable with that they have to understand their voice and what it does on the page, and there's really no way of doing that but to do it day and day and day and day and day out, and to be driven by that, and, you know, to try to be as true as you can to that experience. And so, yeah, I think finding that voice and remembering those lessons. It's in Notre Dame last year, and the guy who was driving the taxi cab said, "Soy del Valle." And I got all the Valley stories. It was like he was going, like he didn't have anybody else from the Valley to tell the stories that he had been holding all these years, and he'd been up there for years and years. But it's such a, it's this thing that you never lose, that you're tied to, that it's the connection of the family. It's the I think it's both the rootedness that, you know, and it doesn't happen to everyone, but there is a definitely rootedness that you realize that you're not going to go anywhere else. That this is, no matter what the opportunities are out there, that this is where your life was meant to be lived, and that this is your world. And people will come back, and there is this yearning, you know, and the sort of mourning that goes on when you leave, that you have left a piece of yourself that nobody from another part of the country, even from the border region, is really going to understand what that means. One of my tíos, my tío Héctor, played harmonica and accordion, and you know, I hear that, and I you know, I'm there. I'm in line getting the food, and I'm getting the, you know, the frijoles in the little styrofoam cup, and I'm there. I mean, every one of those things, you know, and I'm being taken out on the floor, and I'm dancing with the tia, and you know, you know, you can tell somebody, but you can't connect with the experience of what that was and what it means on this other level. And so there's so much tied up in that, you know, Soy del Valle, you know. It's endless.